In 1967, Israel, despite being one of the smallest states on the planet by both population and size, managed to fight a war on 3 fronts against 3 larger opponents and win in under a week. This video will explain how the Israelis were so successful, why Egypt failed, and the repercussions of the conflict. If this is your first time on the channel and you want a credible source of information on Egyptian politics, Middle Eastern politics, or global politics in general, you can subscribe and click the notification bell so you don't miss out on anything. I put all scholarly and non-scholarly sources, cited APA style, in the description below. Why Israel was so successful. To understand why Israel was so successful during the war, we need to understand just how tiny Israel is, especially before 1967. Tel Aviv, the largest city in all of Israel, is only a mere 20 kilometers away or 10 miles from the West Bank, which was then occupied by Jordan. In fact, all of Israel's most densely populated areas were within similar distance from either Lebanon, Jordan, or Egypt, all of whom were enemies. This is important because it means that before a war even started, the Israelis were already at a disadvantage. By merely stepping foot outside the West Bank, Jordanian troops would already be within the suburbs of Israel's economic and political capitals, and would have a serious ability to split the entire state in half. Israel's disadvantage is even clearer when we take into account an offensive from the Egyptian-controlled Gaza Strip and other attacks from Lebanon and Syria. The disadvantage is exacerbated by 2 things. First of all is the distance between Israel's capital and Arab capitals. Israeli troops had to cross much larger areas of land to reach enemy population centers than did the Arabs. Tel Aviv, as mentioned, was a mere 20 kilometers away from the West Bank, and about 60 kilometers from the Gaza Strip. Amman, however, the Jordanian capital, was only around 60 kilometers away from the nearest Israeli border, meaning that Jordan's population centers were not under the same level of risk as Israel's. Israel would essentially be fighting on the home front, whereas the Arabs wouldn't. That's without mentioning the distance between Cairo and the Israeli border, which, aside from being 300 kilometers away, on an entirely different continent and separated by a body of water, requires the crossing of a harsh desert peninsula for almost 200 kilometers. Then there is the size disparity between the state of Israel and its neighbors. In 1960, Israel only had a population of about 2 million people, whereas that of Syria was double the number at 4 million, and that of Egypt was over 13.5 times the Israeli population at about 27 million people. Interestingly, however, the state of Israel did maintain higher populations than Jordan and Lebanon. The result was that the Israeli government took its defense very, very seriously. Because if a war were to break out between Israel and its neighbors, the Israeli state would already be in a life or death position, with most of its major cities under critical risk before the war even started, while those of the Arabs would be in a much safer condition. The Israeli population specifically would also be at direct risk from the war, whereas the Arab populations were not under the same risk. The result was that Israel adopted a policy of offensive defense. This meant that it had to attack its neighbors before they attacked it, because if they attacked first, it would risk the existence of the entire Israeli state. The Israelis also spent a lot of time making sure that their armed forces were in great shape. Because the Israelis had the military disadvantage in size, they had to make up for it in whatever way they could, such as in quality. Conscription was mandatory and nearly every man under 50 was involved in the military somehow. This was underlined by a very high morale throughout the entire country because they believed that they were fighting for their statehood. The offensive offense was exemplified when Egypt removed UN peacekeeping forces from the Sinai Peninsula and then closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. While these actions weren't inherently aggressive by themselves, for the Israelis they were perceived as such for the following reasons. First of all, the Sinai Peninsula had protected Israel from Egypt by being demilitarized. Egypt was and is the largest Arab country by population, and it had the largest military out of all the Arab countries. The Sinai Peninsula was a buffer between Israel and Egypt because it protected Egypt's population center along the Nile River from the front line of war with Israel, which none of Israel's neighbors had for themselves. It also simultaneously prevented the Egyptian military from being right on Israel's doorstep. With Egyptian troops in the Sinai, however, and considering that Sinai was and is sovereign Egyptian territory, the military threat to Israel from the west was much larger. As for closing the Straits of Tiran, roughly 90% of all Israel's oil imports came in from those straits. It goes without saying that closing the straits then would have paralyzed the Israeli state. In order to prevent Egypt from getting the upper hand in Sinai then, Israel launched an invasion of the country before the UN peacekeepers had even left and caught the Egyptian military by surprise. In such a way, they were able to take the fight right to Egypt and prevent them from getting the upper hand. Taking over Sinai would also serve to prevent Egypt from blocking all oil imports through the Straits of Tiran. Why Egypt failed. For Egypt, there were several reasons for the defeat. First of all was the disconnect between the political leadership and the military leadership. Gamal Abdel Nasser was the president of Egypt, however he actually had very little power over the armed forces themselves. Much of the military power was solidified in Field Marshal Abdel Halim Amr, and there was little Nasser could do without publicly opposing Amr, which he didn't want to do. These two severely underestimated the power of the Israeli military. Field Marshal Amr, for example, told the Egyptian foreign minister that, quote, "If Israel actually carried out any military action against us, I could, with only 1/3 of our forces, reach Beersheba," unquote. He turned out to be quite wrong. While Egypt's military was larger, it was not as well organized nor as well trained. Once again, this can be tied back to the lack of coordination between the president and the armed forces, but also other factors. For example, Egypt was fighting a war in North Yemen, which tied down many of its well-trained soldiers. North Yemen War was dubbed Egypt's Vietnam because, like Vietnam, the war took up many resources, ended up with thousands of Egyptian soldiers dead, and wasn't as successful as people might have wanted. On top of all that was the poor military intelligence and communication. From the very beginning in 1967, the Soviet Union warned Egypt that Israel was massing troops along the Syrian border, but this turned out to be false. Regardless, likely in an effort to deter an Israeli invasion of Syria, Nasser went ahead with militarizing the Sinai and closing the Straits of Tiran, and furthermore signing a defense pact with Jordan. The Israelis, for the reasons mentioned previously, went ahead and attacked Egypt, officially starting a war between the two. The Israelis had superior reconnaissance and intelligence, which helped them understand the land they were taking over. They also had better training and discipline than the Egyptian forces, who did not have the same quality of training as Israel. The Arab miscommunications proliferated throughout the war. According to Jordan's King Hussein, Egyptian Field Marshal Amr sent a message to Jordan that Egypt had wiped out 75% of the Israeli Air Force. This encouraged the Jordanians to increase their attacks against Israel, not knowing that the Israelis actually had the upper hand. Regardless, the Jordanian front also proved ineffective, and Jordan lost the West Bank. Military ineffectiveness was not limited to just Egypt either. After fully occupying the Sinai and the West Bank, Israel launched an invasion of the Syrian Golan Heights, and the Syrians failed to defend because, like in Egypt, the military leadership was not great. Repercussions of the war. The war was absolutely disastrous for the Arabs because it put the Arabs in the same geographic predicament that Israel had been prior to the war. Starting with Syria, the Golan Heights was roughly about 60 kilometers away from Damascus. For Jordan as well, Israeli troops were right on the doorstep of Amman. Although Cairo was 100 kilometers away from the Sinai Peninsula, the war of attrition between Egypt and Israel that remained shut down the Suez Canal indefinitely, destroying a very vital part of the Egyptian economy. On top of this, major Egyptian cities like Suez, Ismailia, and Port Said were on the front line of the fighting. Moreover, Israel's occupation of the Sinai was different from Egypt's in one key way. Under Egypt, the Sinai had been demilitarized, and Egyptian troops had to cross 200 kilometers of desert to reach the Israeli-controlled territories. Under Israeli control, however, Sinai was militarized, and a successful Israeli crossing of the canal would have taken the war to Egypt's population core in the Nile River Delta. This made things more difficult for Egyptian leadership because it meant that one single mistake in preventing Israel from crossing could have lost everything. Egypt's risky and fragile situation was reflected in 1973, when that exact scenario happened, except in the opposite direction. That year, the Egyptians caught the Israelis by surprise and successfully crossed the canal, taking over the eastern bank. Soon thereafter, the Israelis were able to cross the canal to the other direction and take over parts of the western bank, including the city of Suez. After some more fighting, a ceasefire was agreed between the two. By this point, both sides wanted peace. Egypt, because the war of attrition took so many resources, held up the economy, and took many lives. Israel, because although it was successful at fighting a three-front war, it was not clear how much longer it could maintain the status quo. A deal was eventually signed between them, which saw the Sinai return to Egypt, and the West Bank turning into a semi-civil authority. The Gaza Strip would remain in Israeli hands until 2005. The Golan Heights, however, were annexed by Israel in 1981 and only recognized by the United States. It remains under Israeli occupation to this day. In conclusion, the Israeli military exercised a doctrine of offensive defense and had the advantage of quality, training, and higher morale. The Arab militaries, by comparison, were not as united and suffered from inferior quality leadership. If you found this video helpful, you might also find this video useful, which explains why Iran kinda hates Egypt, or you might want to know what Egypt's symbolic opinion on the Taiwan crisis is. Thank you for watching.